I buckled my seatbelt with sweaty hands as the steady hum of the plane engine filled the quiet atmosphere of the cabin. The pilot announced that the plane would launch, and soon the gentle G-force pressed into my chest as the plane accelerated. My heart thudded against my chest as I felt the plane lift from the ground. It was an all too familiar sensation of a deep pit in my stomach. I swallowed several times as the plane ascended at a steady rate, further and further away from the sweet, solid ground. I had been so nervous and transfixed during the launch that I hadn't even noticed another person had sat down next to me. I quickly recomposed myself and took deep breaths to calm myself down. Visions of the plane crashing flashed in my mind. The flight would be a slow mental torture for hours on end, until I finally, hopefully, safely landed. The young man sitting next to me fiddled with the flight entertainment unit in front of him and looked through their movie catalog. I was impressed with his calm composure, but then looked around and realized that everyone else was also relaxed. Was I the only one being paranoid? I looked outside the window for the first time and saw the fluffy white clouds. Being so high up, it made me feel like my stomach was still left back in the ground, but I couldn't help but admire the beauty of the clouds. They were nice, fluffy wisps that looked like cotton candy. I could imagine them as incredibly soft and comfortable. I stared into the window a bit more, but soon looking at these same clouds got incredibly boring, and so I decided to finally take a look at the screen in front of me and try to find something to do for the remainder of the flight. While my nerves had subsided for the most bit, I still had that nagging thought at the back of my mind, warning me to be more alert. I suddenly saw a sudden movement through the window in my peripheral vision. I whipped my head around as my heartbeat started to rise again and realized that the sky was no longer visible. The gentle blue color of the sky that reminded me of bright mornings by the beach and the pure white color of the clouds was now gone. In place of it was a murky black void that shifted and moved like TV static. The outside world had seemingly disappeared, and in place was now an ever-shifting blanket of inky black static. It seemed that I was the first to notice it, but soon I heard more gasps in the cabin, and everyone had realized the sudden change. I started to have a panic attack once more and started hyperventilating. I buried my face into my arms and tried to disappear, to somehow get away from this plane, to be back at home, safe and sound. Flight attendants came around and were bombarded with questions that they had no answers to. People wanted to know what had happened. A new wave of panic spread over the cabin. The outside stayed the same, just an inky black static. The pilot announced over the speaker system that they had lost communication over radio, and that no matter how much they maneuvered the plane, they could not find a way out of this storm. For the next 15 minutes, the cabin was dead silent, except for the steady hum of the plane engine that matched the static outside the window and the occasional whimper of a child. The young man next to me was the first one to get out of his seat and try to make sense of our situation. He walked over to the pilot's cabin, but not soon after he was escorted back to his seat by the flight attendants. The captain announced that he wanted everyone to stay in their seats and that the plane would soon be out of the storm. I checked my phone to note the time and noticed that the time hadn't changed at all. I confirmed this with the digital time on my flight entertainment unit and confirmed that the time hadn't changed for the past 20 or so minutes. I decided to keep this one to myself as I didn't want to worry anyone else, but it was inevitable that other people would figure out. Soon, the cabin was filled with hushed tones, as people conversed about the absurdity of our situation. It once more felt like everyone had been lulled into a strange sense of security, as nothing had so far happened outside of the cabin. The calmness spread through the whole cabin, and I stared out into the void, not exactly sure what I was looking for. The void shifted slightly constantly, but it remained the same for as long as I stared at it. The void consumed my vision and started to extend into my peripherals, until it felt like the void surrounded me. The hum of the plane engine and the sounds in the cabin no longer existed. It was just me in the void. Suddenly I felt a tap on my shoulder, and I snapped out of it. It was once again the young man next to me. "What were you looking at?" "Just at what's outside, you know." "You've been staring for the past 20 minutes. "No, man, I just looked into it for like 2 minutes." "You were staring at it for a long time for sure." I was puzzled. To me, it felt like I was only staring at it for a solid minute. Yet the young man kept insisting that I had been transfixed on the void, like a little kid watching his favorite cartoon for a long time. I looked around and noticed that the atmosphere in the cabin had changed as well. Everyone was messing around with their flight entertainment units, not really paying much attention to the void. Suddenly, I heard a woman shout, "There's something there." Everyone immediately stopped what they were doing and shifted their attention to the woman staring out her window into the void. She continued staring while repeating her phrase over and over again, like she was trying to create some sort of demented echo. "I need to see it closer." She got out of her seat and headed straight for the doors of the plane. The flight attendants quickly rushed over to her to stop her, but she pushed them out of her way with inhuman strength. Her eyes were glazed over, and she was staring at a point far away as she opened the plane door effortlessly and jumped out into the black void. There was no pressure drop in the plane as the door was opened. The flight attendants and several passengers walked after the woman to try to save her, but it was too late. She had disappeared into the void the second she had stepped in. The flight attendants closed the plane door, and everyone was ordered to sit tight in their seats. The windows of the plane were sealed by blinds, and a deathly silence overtook the whole cabin. The only sound that occasionally broke the grueling silence was the voice of the only child on the flight. It seemed as if everyone was silently mourning the loss of the woman. A deep dread started to build up in my stomach as I started to think about how I would ever get out of this flight. Minutes turned into hours, and hours turned into days. The only thing that we could see outside the window if we pulled the blind up for a few seconds was the same ever-shifting black void. Every time that I secretly opened the window to see it when the flight attendants weren't looking, it drew me to its beauty. I was mesmerized by that ever-changing, undulating fabric that seemed to be the essence of space-time itself. Time would pass in the blink of an eye when I would stare at it, and before I even realized, someone would be tapping me on the shoulder telling me to snap out of it. Food shortages ensued and panic rose as people started to realize that the plane would most likely never make it out of this place. The excess of time gave way to our minds to come up with far-fetched theories on how the plane possibly made it here. It was evident that we had somehow phased out of our reality and ended up in nothingness. By the second or third day, not that I could keep track of time here, a huge fight erupted in the cabin, It was a trivial matter. A man had reclined his seat and the person behind him didn't like it. At first, it was a lot of arguing before the sounds of smacking filled up the cabin. Everyone watched as the two men beat each other up until one of them fell. The flight attendants tried to stop the fight, but they got into it and they were injured as well. The fight didn't ensue for too long and ended with the flight attendants separating the two men. It was starting to become apparent that the isolation and boredom in the cabin was starting to get to our heads. A long time after that, when the food supplies ran out and everyone was starving, people started to look out of their windows for long periods of time. As everyone knew, time would pass by quickly staring at the immersive black void. Soon after, the pilots walked straight out of the plane. After a long time, possibly weeks, a new sound filled the cabin. There were only 5 people left in the cabin at this point who hadn't walked straight out of the plane to meet with the void. One of them was a flight attendant while the rest were passengers, including me. It was a high-pitched shriek that made my ears ring. I pulled up the blind from my window and looked out of it. I saw bird-like creatures flying in the void next to us. My heart rate peaked and chills ran down my spine. These creatures were otherworldly. They seemed to be made out of the same black fabric as the void, yet stood out in such a way that it seemed as if they had been superimposed on a photo. The static on their skin was much noisier than the static in the black void, and that's what made them stand out. I started to hear powerful thuds on the plane as the mighty birds attacked the plane. The plane was an imposter in the black void, and it seemed as if the birds had taken it upon themselves to destroy it. The heavy glass of the plane started to crack and shatter as the birds relentlessly banged their long beaks and bodies against the plane. Panic ensued in the cabin as people started to run around and cower in various places of the cabin. I ran to the pilot's quarters, to which the door had been left opened. It was this split-second decision that probably saved my life. I observed the cabin through the little peephole in the door. The birds had made their way inside after breaking through and ripping the walls off the plane like they were paper, and they were starting to shred the people inside the cabin apart as well. It's really hard to describe, but it almost seemed like the black void started to spill inside the cabin, like it was a liquid. The plane cabin was absorbed into the black void, and soon all I could see through the peephole was the same inky black void. The birds started to shriek in a different note as their deep hunger and bloodlust had been satisfied. In the blink of an eye, the black void was gone and was replaced by an empty cabin. The plane had somehow repaired itself, but the crew and passengers were all missing. The radio cackled to life.
Flight 307, we lost you there for a minute. Flight 307, report your current status. Flight 307, do you copy?
I spoke into the radio and tried my best to not sound like a lunatic while describing what had happened. The flight control helped me safely land the plane at a nearby airport. I cried when I finally made it to the ground. I was told that the plane had disappeared off the radar for a split second before reappearing. On the other hand, for me, it felt like I had spent months inside that plane cabin. The black void still comes to haunt me at night. It has become the very essence of my dreams. I wake up sweating after being chased by these same bird-like creatures. Sometimes, when I look into the mirror, I can see the black void surrounding me and leaking into my very being. Many flights disappear every year, and I finally found out why. By the time that you read this, I would have met with the void, but I would like to leave one last warning. Before you board a flight, remember the void.